Hey everybody, Chris Aversano here, and before we get into today's podcast, just a quick word from our sponsor, Smart Ship Hub. Shipping doesn't need more tools, it needs quantified and measurable outcomes. Smart Ship Hub Digital is the all-in-one digital platform designed for owners, operators, charterers, and insurers. SSH replaces fragmented systems with a connected maritime ecosystem built on high-frequency data, IoT onboard gateway, and intelligence. From performance monitoring and emission compliance to predictive maintenance and safety analytics, SSH brings everything together in one scalable platform for end-to-end ship management processes. No silos, no duplication, just clarity. Digital transformation doesn't have to be expensive or complex. SSH delivers enterprise-grade capability with near zero capital investment, customizable to specific organizations' workflow, and measurable value. The future of shipping is data-driven, and Smart Ship Hub helps you lead it. Book your demo today at smartshiphub.com/book-a-demo. Thank you again for listening. And if you're interested in advertising with us, contact my friends at Digital Ship. Now, on to the podcast. Welcome, everyone. You are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. This is the podcast where we explore the evolving maritime landscape and hear from the innovators leading the charge. Shipping today is navigating a period of significant change. Between decarbonization, digitalization, and shifting commercial pressures, the industry is being asked to move faster while managing risk across increasingly complex systems. A lot of the conversation focuses on technology and regulation, but in practice, progress often comes down to incentives, alignment, and how decisions get made across charterers, owners, and operators. My guest today is Jan Dieleman, president of Ocean Transportation at Cargill and chair of the Global Maritime Forum. Jan brings a perspective from the cargo and ship chartering side of the industry, where commercial reality meets long-term industry change, and where many of the decisions shaping the future of shipping are made long before they become visible to the broader market. Jan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
And thank you for coming on in this really interesting times. But then again, I think we always talk about black swan events. They seem to be more just a swan event, not so much a black swan event these days.
Yeah,
for sure.
Quite a few, yes.
But before we get into all of that, I've been involved in shipping and commercial side. Now I've kind of pivoted away. But you've been a stalwart. You've been there for a long time. Talk a little bit about your background and how you got interested in shipping and really what you're doing today, leading Cargill, one of the largest charterers and consumers of tonnage that we see, especially in the bulk industry.
Yeah, no, it's actually it's an interesting story. And when I was in university, I wouldn't have thought about going into the maritime industry at all. I knew ships. I grew up not that far from the ocean, so I saw some of them passing by, and that was about it. But I actually started really to get interested in trading and more so in commodity trading. So my career in Cargill, I actually started in commodity trading and did that for a few years. If you ship some of these commodities or you trade some of these commodities, the whole shipping element comes kind of bubbling up, right? And at some point, I spent some time here in the division that we had at the time, and I kind of liked it. And then they offered me a job, so I was like, you know what? Why not, right? And because I was like, if you want to be a really good commodity trader, having a few years of freight trading under your belt is probably going to be quite handy. And I just arrived here, and this is early 2000s, and we had the opening up of China, we had the deregulation of energy markets, and we had a bit of a change in our own business model where from a pure charter, we also started to become a little bit of an operator. And from that time, it was just such a fun ride that I just loved it. And we were doing well and we were growing, and it was really fun. And then actually, I left shipping for 6 years. I went to the energy businesses for 6 years and spent some time in the US, in Houston, etc. And actually came back in 2016. Looking back, I think that was a perfect combination because shipping is as much shipping as it is kind of energy and energy transformation. And that's been a very interesting journey for me. So I was kind of gone, but I managed to get back into shipping again, and I'm just loving it.
I think that is such a good part and really good advice for anybody that's listening that's kind of getting into the industry. is having these different areas of understanding and knowledge, whether it's energy, whether it's the trading side, and bringing that to the freight trading side, because I think it just gives you a competitive advantage, even in just small little areas of just understanding how other people think, right? And that's, I think, one of your strong points, is because you have this side where you not only charter cargoes as a pure charterer, but then as an owner operator, you have to now find a home for those cargoes, sometimes for your own program and sometimes in the market. And what I'd love to ask you is for people who normally sit on one side or the other, I just care about cargo, or I just care about ship. Talk a little bit about bridging that gap, because I think that's really interesting, and a little bit of the misunderstanding that each side has of each other. Because I used to be a broker, so my view was just shut up and agree to the rate so we can move on with life, but in a polite way.
No, I think what you're saying is spot on, right? And if you just look back at ocean transportation, the business I lead today, that's a business of having a fleet anytime from 20 days to 10 years of 650-ish kind of ships at any given time. So it's a really large operation, and part of that is for our internal cargo, as you say, right? So we are a pure charter for probably 20 to 30% of that. Mainly grains, I would say. That's predominantly the product that we do. But then, if you want to optimize a fleet, you have to go into these other industries. You have to go into the energy industry. You have to go into the mining industry. You have to go into the fertilizer industry, and I can keep going and going and going. What I really love in this industry is as you say, in the role that we play, is you have to understand some of these industry that you're actually serving. I think the mistake a lot of people make is that they think that shipping is an industry on its own. But shipping is just an industry that serves a host of other industries. And that is something that I think has helped us a lot. Having a trading background, you can actually put yourself in the shoes of some of these industries and start seeing that certain things need to change, or you see a price movement here or there, and then you can somehow connect the dots. And that is what we're doing here. Coming back to what you said earlier on the role of the charterer versus the owner versus the operator, in our sense, it's kind of blurred. These lines, they used to be very kind of black and white, and this is an owner's matter, this is a charterer's matter, and those things are starting to blur a lot here. And for us, we like to look at this industry much more end to end than just segment by segment.
And I see this in kind of two sort of ways. One, I see this de-siloing internally, right, which is a huge problem. I worked for a very small ship owner, and you would be shocked, Jan, about the siloing of information and data. There wasn't a lot of people here, and for whatever reason, there was this siloing of information. And I think that when you blur those lines, by default, you start to de-silo information, which becomes, again, I think it's a competitive advantage over time, because if an operator of a ship and an operator on the cargo side have to talk more, then they will pick up cues and subtext in a faster way that can help make operational or commercial decisions better.
I fully agree. And if I just look back at our own history, right, as I said earlier, in the beginning, we're just a charterer. And as a charterer, we kind of probably understood 80% what was in the charter party, and the rest wasn't probably too clear at the time, but whatever, that was the standard. So let's roll with it. Nowadays, I think we understand much more how technical shipping also works. We're having people here working for us now with a naval architectural kind of background, which is something that we would never have. We have people here that fully understand all kind of different fuel blends and et cetera, which is something we would never have. So I think those kind of things is starting to evolve, and we're having relationships with yards now in China, Japan, and you name it. And you build up this ecosystem, and what the beauty is of that, it doesn't only help you to kind of understand better and optimize better, but it also provides you a lot of new opportunities of things that you might never have seen if you otherwise would have just stayed in the silo as you described it earlier.
Right. And I think it gets into a bigger thing. We can talk a little bit about this later on your networks, right? Even though you may be a really big player in, say, fuel oil as a commodity, not as a consumable. But okay, all I care about this. But if you start to understand how these different levers can impact business, good, bad, or otherwise, or trend lines, I think that's really where it gets interesting. And then the other piece, I think, is the external part. and we could kind of get into a topic that you and I talked about. We felt like a long time ago is decarbonization, but is regulation, right? And having more lines where people are looking at a wider swath of what they're accountable for, at least maybe they're accountable for the same things, but have to have an understanding of what other people are accountable for. Regulations, whatever type of regulation you want to talk about, is an important part, and certainly around the decarbonization aspect, which you guys are on the forefront of.
I think you got it spot on, right? I think if you take issues like decarbonization, which I think is a brilliant one, right? Cargo cannot decarbonize on its own. It's impossible. What you can do is play a leading role in decarbonizing an industry, right? And by definition, that means that you have to partner. And when we started on the decarbonization journey, and we're much further, and we can talk a lot about that, when we really started, we didn't know anything about this. When we started this, there was still the notion that shipping is super efficient, which it is, and it was never going to decarbonize because it was way too hard. Now we're finding ourselves, after done so many things, like we started measuring our emissions in 2017. We had no clue what our emissions were. But how can you put targets, or how can you kind of start dreaming of what you could do if you don't know where your baseline is, right? So we had to do that.
What's the saying? You can't something what you don't measure. You can't judge what you don't measure.
Yeah, but that's what it is. So you have to have a baseline and say, okay, where are we actually today? And it's been a super interesting journey. And then in those days, we didn't know what fuels were actually possible or available, or what it all would mean. And that's where an industry comes together. And that's why, and I'm playing quite a long-standing role in that, in the Global Maritime Forum. That's where you can put people together. And what you said earlier, you can put a bunch of charters in the room or a bunch of owners on the room, but you're not going to find the solution. You have to put them all in the room. You have to put the charterer, the owner, your fuel supplier, and probably also the regulator at some point in there, and say, how are we going to do this?
Yeah.
And I think that is the beauty of this kind of part of the journey, is you have to collaborate. Now, the good thing is, I think some of the topics have come to the space that you maybe don't need to collaborate as much anymore, because it becomes a commercial opportunity. And in the end of the day, that's where you want to be, because if something is going to be sustainable, it also needs to be financial sustainable, right? And I think some of these initiatives, they start as pre-competitive, and logically now are just getting into the competitive space. And in the end of the day, that's just fantastic to see.
I think that is probably really that gap between what is looking good in theory, what is practical, and then what is sustainable commercially. I was at a roundtable about 2 years ago, and somebody, a CFO of a large tanker company, said, we support fuel efficiency because at the bottom line of each ship, that number goes up. If I burn less fuel, it's very simple. I make more money per day. And if I make more money per day, then I have more money that I can either pay off debt, return to shareholders, invest. I have more money in my bucket. So realistically, that's kind of, I think, kind of a little bit of the gap of people having these great ideas and then to where the rubber hits the road or the hull hits the sea. It doesn't sound as good. Rubber hits the road sounds better, but I think you get the idea.
Yeah, no, I really get the idea. I think if you look at decarbonization, right, there's in the end there's two levers that you have if you want to get to zero, close to zero, whatever you want to put as a goal. The one is saving fuel, right? That's the whole fuel efficiency, and the other part is burning lower or zero carbon fuels. And we can have an endless discussion if it's low or zero or whatever, but let's put that to the side, right? The beauty of the first one is, as you say, there's a payback. There's a payback, and either you like it or you don't like it. And I think the issue that we've had, and this is the role and responsibility that we wanted to take, is there's a lot of unknowns. Because if you go to a vendor, they will tell you it's 10%, 15%, and I always make the joke that if you add them all up, you have a ship that actually produces fuel, right? And if you believe all these things, and we all know that that's not the case. So the only way to find that out is to experiment, to innovate, do things. And that's what we've done. Well, I think we tried everything under the sun by now, and it is giving us a really good understanding. And then you get to this notion also, when there's a payback, we don't need to have an endless discussion on sharing or whatever. If I know there's a payback and I get the benefits, I'm happy to put the investment in. I just need to somehow feel that the risk I'm taking is manageable. And as long as you can do that, then I think the industry come a long way, and that's going well. Now, the big issue, and that's where the regulation comes in my mind, is if you start talking about these lower and zero carbon fuels, it's about who's going to pay the premium. And that's a very different discussion than saying who's going to get the savings, right? So that's a very different
Yeah.
discussion. And
Yeah.
we've tried to find, and this is the problem, that we probably have more in bulk than some of the container lines, car carriers, etc., etc. We are very far from the end user. So for us, it's very difficult to somehow pass that premium on, because the premium, if you look at it in the end product, call it a pair of Nikes or whatever you want to call it, it's very small. But the problem is, if you're in the middle with this bulk shipment, it's a big number. And that's where the issue sits. And that's where we've been struggling. And that's where I think the regulator has a role to play to somehow get a system in place where that bridge between fossil fuels and the lower and zero carbon fuels somehow gets bridged with a contract for difference or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and I think that that's that whole kind of risk allocation between what, the premium for fuels and who's going to pay that. I think, but you guys are kind of an interesting spot because you do wear all the hats, the the two hats, charter and owner operator. So, I'm sure you've had a lot of spirited discussions on, well, we want the charter party to read this way when we're owner, but the other way when we're charter. And I would imagine that puts you in a interesting situation from good, bad, and indifferent, right? Because, and then also your role in the Global Maritime Forum, which I know has been very active in trying to bring all the parties, as you mentioned, to the table to come up with an agreeable framework. And I think maybe I'm getting a little bit too deep in my own water, out of my own comfort zone, but with the different schema, EU ETS and Fuel EU, there are ways where the benefits are more direct with the lower emissions. I think each one is a little different on who gets the benefit, but at least there is more of a commercial line that you could draw that'll either offset or either cost or you get the benefit or vice versa.
I think the beauty, in a way, for the part of the industry we are in the bulk side, is the charter is in the end the one who pays the fuel bill, right? That's where it sits, right? In the end of the day, left, right, or center, it comes with us. So it's also very much the incentive for us to somehow manage that. And same with fuel ETS and or fuel EU and ETS. In the end of the day, you can write whatever charter parties, but in the end of the day, the one who's going to have to absorb this is the charter. So there's always these mechanisms of how to do that. But I think, as you said earlier, these schemes are complicating life. And I think if you're a small operator, this is not a pleasant environment to be in, because you will have to comply to some of these things. But coming back what you said earlier as well is, what we're trying to do is just be fair, be reasonable, and just don't start playing games. I can't just show up and they say, oh, now I'm wearing my charter's hat, so now I'm feeling this. And then the next day I'm saying like, oh, now I'm acting as an owner, and now I'm saying the complete opposite. That's not going to work, right?
Yeah, no. People see through that too quickly.
Exactly.
I do want to go back to an earlier point where you said that you were able to try different, and this is what, when we were at the ASMA conference and I was watching you speak, really kind of stuck out at me is, you have availability or at least access to fleet that is large by any scale. And you said, hey, we could try different things on our ship. And my question was to you then and kind of now is, when you try something on a ship, let's say hard wind, or let's say a special coating or any sort of efficiency, something that'll benefit your efficiency. You talk about like one of the problems is transparency in our industry, right? And that fine line between commercial transparency and trying to move the industry towards decarbonization. Talk about your approach a little bit, because I found it very interesting on, let's say if you implement, I think you were talking about ammonia at the time, implement that and to give a feeling and feedback beyond internally without hurting your commercial advantage.
Yeah, so in the end of the day, the philosophy that we are taking, right, is we want to be able to provide solutions for the decarbonization kind of ambitions of our customers, right? And the reality is they're all different. There's people that have no ambitions because they might be in a part of the supply chain that this is not able to do. For instance, if you're moving grains into East Africa, I think before you can talk decarbonization, that is going to take a while. But if you're taking copper into an industry or you're taking a green steel or whatever, that's a very different thing. So we very early on said it cannot be one size fits all. We just want to be able to tailor some of the solutions to people. So if you want to build that toolkit where you need to start experimenting. Otherwise, you're not going to get anywhere. So that's what he started to do. And the goal with that was that if someone has a new technology, we want them to call us first. We want to be the ones that they say, you know what? If I want to commercialize this, who do I need to talk to? It's us. On the customer side, if someone wants to have some questions on decarbonization or whatever, we want to be the first call. And if anything comes out of it or not, who knows, right? And I think we got there actually by the approach that we've been taking. And then I think you get into this point where you say is like, what is commercially kind of for you important to keep and what do you share? And there's always a trade-off between the two, right? And also us with a trading kind of house background, I think the initial thought was always like, well, let's keep it inside and let's see if we can monetize it somewhere along the way, right? That's always been somehow the mindset. But if you really want to move an industry, you cannot do that. So we said, if you want to be a leader, you can't just lead in this and keep this behind, and you can't just pick and choose, right? So we've really taken the approach and say, you know what, we're happy to share. It doesn't mean that we're going to be sharing with everyone and his mother, but people that genuinely are also on this train, willing to invest, willing to do things, we're more than happy to share. And to be
Interesting.
honest, if you're a ship owner with one or two ships, I don't think I can ask the same kind of commitment to some of these things than someone that's 100 ships maybe, right? So I think you also need to be realistic there.
I'm really glad you brought this up because this was kind of the sidebar conversation because I remember it was you and Lois from International Seaways. And my thought was, well, you said, we put something on, I forgot, like 5 or 6 or 8 ships. I'm like, that's about 1% of your fleet that you control, where 1% of Lois's fleet isn't a full ship. It's like 8/10 of a ship, with the 80 or so ships.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm misquoting numbers. And I was like, wait a minute, how is this going to work? But I think you get back to your point is that you're able to share and learnings and findings and do it in a way with people that are not just out there to take the information, but then to maybe make their own decisions, whether it's on, I've had a couple people on the podcast with the hard wind sails. That seems to be something that has gained a lot of popularity, obviously coding and these other things. And again, it's all different based on, like you said, copper trade versus East African grains versus my background on petroleum versus, short haul MRs in the Gulf down to the Caribbean is very different than VLCCs, doing 40 days at sea and then going to sit, at the loop, right? Those are 3 very different voyages, just looking at the bulk industry. So that's a really, I think, a very forward-thinking view that not everybody takes.
No, and I think what you said earlier, right? And I think very early on, we found these dynamics that we keep on talking sometimes about one maritime industry, and there is no one maritime industry. If you're looking at cruise ships, it's very different than if you're looking bulk, if you're looking containers, if you're looking car carriers, etc., etc. Even within bulk, as you say, right? If you, for instance, take the example of energy savings, right? How much energy saving are you going to put on a small ship that sits 50% of the time in port? Is that the best investment, or do you pivot to the Cape sizes where you might be sailing 80% of the time? Right? So you have all these trade-offs to be made. And I think the beauty that we have, having that big scale, not just in number, but also across the different segments, we can also optimize some of these technologies and options for the size of the fleet that you actually have. And I think if you're a smaller ship owner, sometimes you might be kind of getting too excited about something that, to be honest, is maybe not for you, but it's very difficult
Yeah.
because people have a passion and they want to do something, which I admire, to be honest with you.
I look at like your example of small ships that sit a lot in port. Maybe the thinking is investing on port infrastructure. Again, a ship owner with 3 ships that run coastwise and sit a lot of time at port doesn't make sense, but maybe it's a bigger thought of shoreside infrastructure where you're using some sort of more renewable energy, right? Whether it's sun, solar, thermal, and you're bringing that into the port. That's an interesting kind of dynamic where that makes sense for certain ships, right?
Or take the other example. If you're sitting a lot in port, you probably have a lot of hull fouling. So maybe you should look at paints and underwater cleaning. That might be more fitted for smaller ships. And wind might be better placed on ships that sail a lot, right?
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's all these that they all
Like,
sound very, very simple, but in the end of the day, sometimes people will get so into it that sometimes you have to lift yourself up and say, what are we doing here? And I remember having had a couple of conversations with some of the cruise lines down in Miami on future fuels and what we could do together. And to be honest, I would have never thought 10 years ago that I would be sitting with a cruise line talking about decarbonization, right? And you're having these discussions, and very quickly it became clear to me that ammonia wasn't probably the best thing to put on a ship with 7,000 people having a holiday. So that was like, oh, maybe that doesn't fit here.
maybe
And that's
not
as you
ammonia.
go. Yeah.
And I think going back to your point, and this is something that I don't want to say struggle with, but comes up in conversations, is people say, well, you're an expert in maritime. I go, no. I kind of know this very narrow tankers, not even dry. I know a little bit about dry bulk. I had somebody reach out to me and ask if I knew anything about drayage and port authority, movements at the port, going off the container ships to the yard, to the train. I'm like, you know what I know? I know what I can see when I drive now 95 and you have Newark there. I go, that's kind of where I start and end. But it is such a big industry. Again, when you talk about things like cruise and ro-ros and their concerns and obviously their trading patterns, which are very different. And even within the bulk industry, a cape that kind of has one or two, really one cargo type versus a handy that could be doing grain versus scrap metal versus, so on and so forth. So it's a very diverse industry, even within itself, that a lot of people don't realize.
Yeah, I fully agree.
And I think that brings us kind of to, another interesting point is data, right? You must just be inundated with data, not only on data on the emissions and everything, but certainly just on cargo and on trade and what you're getting off the ship. And of course, we're recording this after the invasion in Iran. A lot of the data that you're getting, you have to make sure is right. How do you, sitting at the head of ocean transport for Cargill, how do you kind of have a data plan and sift through, well, at least in the case of what's going on in Iran, what's real and what's not, and then more importantly on the data that you're getting, whether it's trading data or emissions data, how do you handle that and deal with it so you can make the best decisions? And I'll caveat that by saying make the best decisions at a given time, because the decision right now that you make may look like, what'd you think about? Well, I could only do what I could do at the time. So
in hindsight, it's always easy indeed. So because you never have the full picture, right? And I think this comes back to this notion of if you're in a role like we are, you can't sit there waiting for the perfect information and then make your decision, because it's just too late. It doesn't work. So you need to be comfortable in taking risk, and that might mean having 80% of the picture kind of completed, and then you just have to go. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But coming back to data, for us, we've been on data for a long time, and I think we were probably one of the first. And this, I think, is probably going down 15 years when we started to track all ships in the world with AAS data already. That was long before anybody was looking at it, and that was very helpful for us. We didn't really know what to do with it at the time or how to monetize it, because it's nice to know a lot of things, but nice to know is not paying the bills. I always say it's a little bit more than that. So you have sometimes this tendency to just to take more data, and more data is not always better. So we really focused a lot on, okay, what are some of the key data, and what is the best version of the truth, right? And I think that's what you came with earlier. So if you take the situation in the Persian Gulf at the moment, we're watching the AES data again, the signals. We're seeing what on a daily basis, we see what's going in, what's going out, and that's where you start, right? I think where the problem comes in, and that's probably lately even more, just because of the sheer amount of news that you're getting, it's sometimes difficult to sift through what's real, what's not real. And so that is a bit complicated. And that's why you need to keep your head a bit cool and not react on every single headline. I think that is kind of the approach that we're taking, and just taking, okay, what's real, what's maybe not so real, and just take a little bit of a step back there. And I think where I'm spending a lot of time on in these kind of situations, like we're in again, to be honest with you, because we just had the USTR, we had China USTR, we had the invasion of the Ukraine, we had COVID. So we had quite a few of these lately.
Black Swan events aren't really
yeah, no,
unique anymore.
yeah, no, we seem to be getting quite good in dealing with them, which is a bit of a worry in itself. But I think what I'm also trying to spend a lot of time on, not just what's happening in front of you, but also what are some of the second or third kind of order kind of consequences of some of these things, right? And one of the things that's happening today with that area being blocked, what does it mean for bunker availability in the rest of the world? What does it mean for some of the other things? What does it mean for compliance in Europe? What does it mean for LNG pricing going forward, et cetera, et cetera? So you're trying to not just everything that's in front of you, because we have the teams which are all on this. They know how to deal with this, but it's also my role to lift my head up a little bit more and say, okay, so what does this all mean, And that's what I'm spending a lot of time on.
And I think that goes back to your original thought of the whole idea of not being just so pigeonholed into one area, because you, like you said, you have naval architects. Okay, well, what does naval architect have to do? Well, marine engineering, naval architecture, all of a sudden, can our ships get into certain ports that we haven't been asked to? Are these looking at fuel availabilities? What is this going to do to our engines if we're manufacturing this? And this is not a 6-month event. This is a 3-year event. And we're thinking about building ships this way. So it gets into these, the order of magnitude where it kind of impacts everything. And having more of a wider view certainly helps. But I think the other question I have is, how do you avoid paralysis by analysis, right? Because I think that is one of the things about data. You alluded to it, is you got too much data. All of a sudden, it's like you're waiting for the perfect moment. And I had this conversation with my kids that play baseball. It's like, dude, I know you're waiting for the perfect pitch, but just swing the damn bat, and you may miss, but it's better than sitting there with the bat on your shoulder, right? So how do you convey that to your team, and balancing the risk portfolio, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's where leadership plays a role, right? Because it's around setting the right culture around those things, and it's the same. And you have it, I have it. You start watching the news on television, and then if you watch it for half an hour, the other half an hour is normally not going to bring you anything more than the first half hour, right? Because if you're into it, then it's very easy to keep on going, and there might be something new that you discover.
It's an hour out of your time, and you're like,
yeah, and
you're
sitting there,
here?
and you're sitting there, and to be honest, I also notice, and there's nothing against engineers or anything like that, but some people have the tendency to really having to go all the way to the bottom to get the answer, right? And the reality is, in a commercial world, a lot of times you don't have that time, we just have to set the boundaries and say, you know what, I think we know enough. Take the wind project that we had, right? I think we could have spent another 2 years comparing all kind of notes and different systems and stuff. And at some point we said, you know what, I think we know enough. Let's go for it. But it also means that if it doesn't work, I can't come back and start complaining that it didn't work because people didn't do their homework well. So if you're taking this approach, you have to be all in, and you have to be also just willing to accept that risk is risk, and that means that things sometimes don't plan out as they go. And for me, going into those kind of things, the most important thing is, do we know what the downside is if it goes wrong, and are we able and happy to deal with that? And if the answer is yes, then let's go.
And I think it gets back to the cultural aspect, right? If you're going to yell and scream at your junior analyst because something wasn't available, or they thought, no, I mean, this isn't going to be important, but it turned out to be more important. Well, then they're going to just tell you what you want to hear all the time, which is going to be, no, it's never going to work. And then they can back out of it, but then you don't take risk. You can't advance and then really kind of, help solve the problem, whether it's efficiency, whether it's profitability, or the combination of the both. So I think a lot of it, like you said, is a forward looking, or having a, kind of progressive management that way, which brings me kind of to another sort of thought here. Younger professionals, as you kind of talk to folks, and listen, anybody works with Cargill, I'm sure you have lots of great training programs. Maybe you got somebody coming through the maritime program and they've seen the cool, great, trading, or maybe they're into finance, M&A opportunities. How do you get them to say, hey, look, I've made some decisions and I've ended up coming back to shipping? How do you get them to stay and to embrace the shipping side of what you're doing and the industry in general?
Yeah, well, what I find is that when I do things like this and people listen, or I go to universities or whatever, and I talk about the industry and I talk about what's all going on, you see people looking at you like, "Wow, I didn't realize this," right? So I think it's an industry that is very unknown, but this is an industry that has an absolute front seat on what's happening in the world, basically, right? That 90% of world trade goes via seas, right? And we talked about it earlier, all these different kind of industries that we're serving. You get to see so many things, and there's so many variables. And put on top of that an energy transition that is coming to this as well, which is giving a whole new kind of dimension to what traditional shipping has been. I think this is an industry that is just super interesting. I think it's under served in terms of attention, I think. And I think it's something that also personally to me, it's also an industry that really matters. We are moving essential goods, right? We're not talking about moving just Rolexes. We're talking about moving food, energy, and all these kind of things. So I think it's also in terms of a purpose, this is something that really matters.
I think that that's a great way to put it. And I gave a presentation last year to my daughter's seventh grade class about, job, what you do. And actually, she asked me for the presentation last week, and she's like, "Oh, one of my friends doesn't believe that shipping is the most efficient way." And I'm like, to move goods. And I'm like, well, okay, yeah, for a Rolex, maybe not, but because you want it tomorrow. But for like a barrel of oil, you're not putting that on an airplane. And I think that talking about the importance right now, what's going on in Iran, and obviously the impact to the other Gulf nations, the last I saw, 20,000 seafarers stuck. That's the IMO estimate with I forgot the number of ships that are stuck. And now you're having events like MSC, the Mediterranean Shipping Company, basically declaring an end of voyage for their containers, dropping off containers. And, given that a lot of that area is very reliant on outside imports for food and for other things, MSC is just dropping off containers and saying, we're done with the voyage. Like, sorry, you have to get them yourself. So all of a sudden you realize how important that link is, even though it is a hidden, for many people, a
Yeah,
hidden profession.
we've seen that a few times before, right? And I think this is an industry, when it works, nobody cares. But
Mm-hmm.
when something doesn't work, then there's a problem. And I think in Belgium they like to say this no shipping, no shopping, which I think is actually quite spot on. And it was
Yeah.
in COVID as well, right?
Yeah.
All of a
Yeah.
sudden when sofas didn't arrive or whatever, then it was like, well, what happened, right? When the Evergreen ship got stuck in the Suez, all of a sudden it was like, oh, what's happening here, right? And I think it's those moments that I think you can see how important it is what we do. And also, to be honest, how cool is it that the maritime industry is always finding a way around it and keep supply chains moving, right? And I think that's something that is really, really underestimated.
Exactly. Like we keep the clock ticking over. I joke around here, you get your toilet paper at Walmart, right? You'll get it. It'll happen. Everything else is shut, but that's ending up, at your local Walmart or your Aldi or wherever you are. But I always use that example. People don't care until the toilet paper runs out,
Yeah, I
basically.
agree.
As graphic as that sounds. Jan, this has been great. I always finish up with this question. You're a very senior guy, one of the most senior guys in the industry. Thank you for coming on. But I love this. You're busy. You're managing a huge book. What do you throw in your bag when you travel in terms of reading? And it doesn't have to be like I'm reading philosophy or Better Business
No, no.
books, but like, I love to read Westerns or sci-fi or whatever.
Yeah, I like to mix it up a little bit. Over the last probably year, I've read a lot of books around AI, simply because I just wanted to make sure I was up to speed, because it is going to be one of the bigger disruptors. And I think if you're a leader, you can't just not kind of know what it is and toy with it and stuff. So I spent quite some time on that. But at the moment, I'm actually reading a very interesting book, which I think fits very well with what I said earlier. It's called Material World from Ed Conway. Ed is a journalist for a long time. He's focused on commodities, and he's really laying out the real importance. And I think it's six basic commodities that are really making sure that the world actually ticks. And those kind of things is great for me to sometimes really go back to basics and say, okay, but what are the real things that actually matter, and what are the things that I didn't know? Why is this happening? And it's like, now I understand it. And there's a lot of these things which I like to sometimes mix up with coming back to some things closer to the industry and sometimes things very differently.
Yeah, I've been trying to explore a little bit on AI, because you see all these things about, well, you could like put an AI assistant and then let it look at your files and they'll plan your day. And I'm like, that's kind of interesting. And then you start to think about, I think about just even having this podcast, like, oh, like I have over 125 episodes. What can happen with this, right? In terms of content and patterns, and kind of build, like, how do I build better podcasts in the future? So there's a lot of interesting. I've been reading more
We'll have
like
a
kind
virtual
of
Chris soon, not?
I'm irreplaceable, Jan. Come on. Anyway, a virtual me. No, there won't be a bot doing this. Not that I'm aware of. But for full disclosure, I do use AI to help me with the show notes and do some of the editing here on the platform that I use. But thank you very much for coming on, Jan. I hope everybody listens to this enjoyed. I had a great conversation, and it's really great to hear about the leadership, your journey in leadership, and then the leadership that Cargill is showing in decarbonization and really in digitalization. Like you said, you've been looking at this for 15 years and trying to use it in your day-to-day. So thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.